All right, so what would bilateral trade agreements even look like? Chris Sands is a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University, joins us from Baltimore. From Waterloo, we have Hugo Paransko, deputy director of the International Law Research Program at CG. It's nice to see you both. And Chris, if I can start with you, is a bilateral agreement even a rational option at this point?
It depends on who you ask. From the U.S. point of view, it allows the U.S. to have the most leverage over a smaller partner. So I think it appeals to Trump and Trump supporters because they see it as a way of kind of really squeezing Canada, squeezing Mexico, and hopefully getting more concessions out of both.
Hugo, I mean, there's a lot to get into, and I want to get into the weeds on how do we even get there. But is there a scenario where do we have to consider this is a far more likely outcome now than it was even a week or two ago?
Well, you know, as time marches on and the NAFTA negotiations are not coming to a conclusion, I think that the option really will be, if the U.S. decides to withdraw from the NAFTA, the trade is so large between the three nations, trade in North America, that I think it'll make sense to set up bilateral deals. It doesn't mean that it will be better deals than the NAFTA as a whole, but certainly it would make sense for the three countries to continue to have some form of free trade rather than just the WTO rules.
In Evan Dyer's piece just earlier, we heard from Andrew Leslie saying Canada remains committed to a trilateral process. Chris, does it even matter if Canada says, yeah, we're going to go trilateral, so long as if the American president says, no, we're going to make bilateral deals? Is that kind of what we're going to have to do?
Well, I think so. I think the way this would proceed is that the Trump administration would announce they were suspending talks with Canada and focusing on Mexico now, because with Mexico's election in July, there's some urgency to dealing with some of the issues on the Mexican-U.S. front. So they'd pursue that, and Canada would be left sort of twiddling its thumbs, I think, looking for opportunities to restart talks. But I think USTR would focus on Mexico, and when that deal was done, it might be passed by the lame duck legislatures, both the U.S. Congress after the midterms and the Mexican Congress, so that by the time we get to the State of the Union in January of 2019, the U.S., presumably President Trump, will say, well, look, NAFTA's dead. We've got a great new deal with Mexico that's much, much better, and we're going to start talks with Canada next, putting Canada in a negotiating position with its federal election just a few months later in October.
Walk me through that, because that sounds, incredibly confusing and chaotic. It sounds like we'd end up with something like, Mark Warner today was calling it a zombie NAFTA deal, where the president has made some decisions, Congress hasn't changed its take on tariffs. Chris, and then Hugo, what does that actually look like? I mean, how much chaos ensues from a decision like that?
Well, I think one of the benefits of it and one of the appeals for the U.S. is that when you combine it with tax reform, two bilateral agreements, only U.S. content counts in both. And so the U.S. would be the privileged place in North America to do everything. And even Canadian and Mexican companies would start thinking about putting some of their core operations in the U.S. And that's why I say when you combine it with tax reform, that gives them the money to do it. It's hugely America first. And I think that the chaos would be resolved by people saying, well, we might as well just ship things to the U.S. because doing business in Canada and Mexico will be at a disadvantage. Canada more so than Mexico, because Canada has a smaller domestic market, whereas Mexico at least has that, which is a major attraction for doing business there.
Hugo, describe for me what a border crossing the morning after an American side deal with Mexico before a Canadian deal is made. What does the bridge in Detroit to Windsor, what does it even look like?
Well, you know, that some of the dynamics would change, but if I can comment a little bit on what Chris just said, I wouldn't entirely agree, because it's a question really of costs for industries, and you know, where in the U.S., where costs are much higher, will it make sense for companies to relocate to the U.S., or will it make better sense to relocate, for instance, to Central America? The U.S. has an agreement with the CAFTA agreement in Central America. Will it make more sense to relocate to Colombia? So I wouldn't say that it is a hugely America First deal. I do agree entirely with you that it will create a lot of confusion. The dynamics in both borders will change. But, you know, the one thing that has to happen first is the U.S. has to make a decision whether or not to withdraw from the NAFTA. I really don't see how, without clarity there, both Canada and Mexico will continue to engage in discussions with the U.S. A decision has to be made, in my view.
And Chris, if indeed, and it looks increasingly likely that we would see some kind of an American threat, if not outright withdrawal, is international law clear about what kicks in the morning after a U.S. withdrawal from NAFTA? Would we go back to the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement of '88? Would we go to World Trade Organization tariffs? Are we clear on what might happen then?
Well, somewhat. I mean, under the U.S. law or U.S. Constitution, trade belongs to Congress. And so the president's declaration of a withdrawal would probably be challenged in court until Congress weighed in one way or the other. I think that's a really important factor to keep in mind, because with the U.S. starting trade wars, not just with our North American neighbors, but with China, the steel and aluminum fight with the European Union and Japan, I think there's growing concern in Congress that there needs to be a new discussion about what U.S. trade policy is all about. Donald Trump has been negotiating under authority Congress granted to the executive branch in 2015. If Congress acts with a resolution of disapproval, which the president does not have to sign for it to be valid, between now and June the 30th, they can revoke the trade negotiating authority and start a new dialogue with the administration about a new set of authorities with some limits. And I think that would provide a lot of useful pause to reconsider where we're headed, because the chaos that I agree with Hugo is a serious concern is only going to multiply as we go forward.
And Hugo, I mean, in a weird way, it does remind me of the executive order on immigration from Muslim countries, where there was an order, then there was a court challenge, there was chaos at the airports. Am I way off base in assuming that there might be a scenario not unlike that one the morning after a withdrawal from an American withdrawal from NAFTA?
Well, no, I think you're exactly on point. There will be chaos for several reasons. First of all, the notice of withdrawal has to be sent to Canada and Mexico 6 months before, at least 6 months before the withdrawal actually kicks in. There is, I think, uncertainty today as to whether the U.S. will actually withdraw. I fully agree with Chris. I think it will play out in the U.S. courts. And the confusion and the uncertainty for traders, for investors in all three countries will be great. That's exactly the scenario that I think we're looking into. And you know, we saw the Canadian dollar slide today. We saw the Mexican peso slide today, and that will just happen or continue to happen if that were to be the case.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, but great discussion from you both. Really appreciate it. Chris Sands from Johns Hopkins University and CG's Hugo Perez.